and welcome to the Art of Being Human. Now, having discussed personality and what it is, and having discussed the complications of the self-concept and what it is, I want to talk a little bit about the human brain and how it grows and what it means. Because one of the problems we have in society is that we expect people to understand things that their brains can't comprehend. And we expect that if we understand something, they should understand it too. How many times have teenagers been told, "Why did you do that? You should know better." And I don't understand it. You should have more common sense. Well, common sense is not something that most teenagers are blessed with, and it's not their fault. They just don't have it because of the fact that their brain has not developed enough to be able to have it. You can only do what your brain is complicated enough to do, what your brain has developed enough to do. So I'm going to give you a few little pointers here about the human brain and how it grows. These are, let's consider these to be kind of rules of thumb. The human brain grows from back to front. And here I'm going to use the chart that I have in the human brain, which I oftentimes bring in. Back of the brain, what have you got there? The medulla. You've got various lobes, temporal occipital lobe. The cerebellum is right here. And as you go toward the front, what do you get in the front? The frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are used for thinking, for judgment, for understanding the results of decisions that you make, understanding the consequences of decisions that you make. The back of the brain grows first. And it's not involved with thinking so much, it's involved with the functioning of the human body. Have you ever noticed, after a child is born, if you take a look at their proportions, most of the proportions are the head is larger than the rest of the body is. The legs are probably the smallest. The arms are probably the smallest. But the torso is larger. That has all the organs that have to develop so they can become a human being. They already are a human being, so they can develop to have the full health of the human being. And then the brain has to develop very, very rapidly. So you're going to get the bottom part of the body in proportion to the top part of the body. The bottom part of the body, the legs and so forth, the feet, are going to be smaller. Why? A baby doesn't have to walk for months, so therefore, why would that develop first? The brain has got to develop first, and the organs so that they work with each other. There has to be a homeostasis where the brain, where the body works with itself and the organs work together. But getting back to the brain, it grows from back to front. So you're going to have the back part of the brain, which is not involved with thinking and understanding and reasoning. That's necessary for survival. That is going to grow first. Anything that has to do with survival grows first. And then in later years, the frontal lobe develops, but it's not completely developed until mid-20s. You can say maybe 25. And why is this important? You cannot expect a person to understand things that have to do with reasoning, consequences for behavior, if the brain is not there yet. I was talking to one of my relatives, not one of my nieces, but nephew's wife, one of my nephew's wives, and her son was getting into the teenage years. And he's a good kid. He really is a good kid. And so she said, I don't understand why he doesn't seem to use common sense. Why did the teenagers do all this dumb stuff? And I explained to her, because the brain isn't geared to understand it yet. It takes so long for the human brain to develop. And the parts of the brain that develop in terms of reasoning ability and understanding the consequences of your behavior and understanding what reasoning is all about and judgment and having common sense, that's the last to develop. And we think that that's developing along with the rest of the body, along with the rest of the brain, but it's not. there's a damper on it, you know. So therefore, people at teenage years, preteen years, and young adulthood, they misconceive things all the time. Why? Because they just don't understand. Because their brain isn't geared to understand. So we had quite a lecture. I talked to her quite a bit about the human brain. Don't expect it to do what it's not able to do. If the child at 12 doesn't understand that it's unsafe to go out with guys or girls on the internet, having never met them, they don't understand danger. Why would they understand danger? If they've been protected and it's up to the parents to do that, they can't conceive unless they've been abused. Now, I would never want this to be the case, but unless they've been abused or been in a bad environment where they've had to learn the hard way, a child doesn't conceive that anyone's going to hurt them. They just don't, they can't conceive of it. Why? Because the brain isn't ready for it yet. You know, as you get older, you become more protective of yourself. I know that I used to drive fairly long distances to get to church services where I was preaching and then get back to where I was living, and I wouldn't have a cell phone with me. And I was an adult at the time. I was a young adult, but I was an adult at the time. And so I would go down to people's churches if they wanted me to, and I would preach. I would do all the things I'd been scheduled to do. Then I'd take out. I would take off, and I would drive back, you know, middle of the night, roads that are really unsafe, very curvy, hard to see, not knowing who would be on the road, not knowing if I'd been followed. Was I afraid of it? No. Oh, I'll be fine. Nothing's going to happen to me. And I had one of my friends who was a doctor that said, Pat, you've got to get yourself a cell phone. If you're going to be traveling like this and preaching all over Kingdom Come, you've got to have a cell phone. Oh, I'm all right. My car's fine. Nothing's ever going to happen. And that's what happens when you're young. You don't have a good grasp on what can go wrong. And fortunately for me, nothing went wrong. But then if it was snowing out and I wanted to take a 3-hour drive because I wanted to go somewhere, I'll be okay. Well, do you have a shovel? No, but I won't get stuck. You know, and it seems silly now at my age. I never would think that way now, because as you get older, you get more wise, and you say, well, I wouldn't go out in this kind of weather, especially if I didn't have a blanket in the car, extra water in the car, if I didn't have gloves, mittens, and all of that stuff, if my tank wasn't filled, all of that, you see. So we get more protective, and we get wiser as we grow older. But that's a product of brain development. And it also is a product of experience. I've driven 3 or 4 hours during a bad snowstorm and nothing's ever happened. I never got into an accident. But I was just fortunate because I'd see accidents along the way and I'd say, oh, that's too bad. I'm sorry they were in the accident. But it never would dawn on me. I'm just as able to get into an accident as anybody. Now, a flake of snow, I wonder if I should drive. I might get into an accident. It's just the way that you perceive things. So the frontal lobes are the last to develop, but they do develop in mid-20s. By that time, a person has more of a sense of who they are and what they're about and the importance of being careful and all of that. If a child is molested, or if you've been molested, or if you've had any kind of abuse, your emotional development tends to stop at the age that you were abused. And if you don't have a healing of that, then your emotional age stays right at that age. It stops at the age that you were abused, and it may never get further than that unless you experience some kind of healing. Anyone who's been abused really has to have healing, and it's almost impossible to heal yourself. You have to have somebody help you through it because you are crippled by it. If you've been abused and you've been hurt, emotionally as well as physically, then what happens is that you can develop a brain injury from that. And I'm not saying that anybody hit you over the head and actually damaged your brain, but months and years of you're no good, you can't take care of yourself, you're not very smart, why would anyone want to be with you? You'll never amount to anything. And you got to remember what I've said before about perception. Perception is everything. You believe what you perceive. And that's a cornerstone for self-concept. If you've been told over the years, you're not worth very much, you can't do anything right, you keep spilling the milk, you keep doing this wrong, you keep doing that wrong. And if you're demeaning the person, now it's all right, people have to be corrected, children have to be corrected, but they must never be demeaned. To be demeaned means that you're telling a child you're of less worth, you don't have any worth. If a child does something wrong and I say, you can't do this, and this is the reason why you can't do it, but I love you and you're very intelligent and I know you'll be able to make changes. And I do it in a positive way, not a mean way, but in a positive way. Yes, I am angry, but but I think that you're a great person. You just have to learn to do things differently. Well, I'm doing it in a positive way. That's not going to hurt a person. It's just going to change them, and they need to have change. However, if I go to a child and say, you never do anything right, you're always making mistakes, when are you going to grow up? When am I going to see you actually accomplish something? You don't have any ability. Why do you keep trying to do that you're not good enough? On and on and on and on it goes like a broken record. So what happens to the person? That's emotional abuse. And you have demeaned them by just telling them, you can't do it, don't try. You'll never be able to do it. Why? Because you're too dumb. You'll never be able to do anything right. You've never done anything right. So the whole self-concept, remember what I said about self-concept before. Self-concept is what you think other people think about you. And that's a good part of it. So if your parents or significant other or somebody is saying to you all the time, you're not worth anything, you're not worth anything, you can't do anything right, you'll never do anything right, then what's going to happen? You're going to believe, I can't do anything right. Every time I try something, it's wrong. I never do anything right. My mother told me that. My father told me that. My uncles and aunts told me that. I'm just not a very good person. You start to believe that nonsense. And when you start to believe it, it becomes you, and that becomes your reality. You live that reality. You look at everything through that reality because that's what you've been taught, and that's what you've learned, and that is who you believe you are. Now, how do you change it? Well, you really need help to change it by a skilled person who knows what they're doing. And other people who say, no, don't listen to that. That's a lot of garbage. No one has the right to tell you that you're inferior. You're not inferior. But it takes a whole learning process to get over that, and sometimes that can take months. And if you are inclined to think of yourself as not being a good person, then what's going to happen is that can go on for years and years and years and years because there's nobody to help you change it. And you do not really have the facility to change it yourself. What has happened is that your frontal lobe, the front part of the brain, now has a concept. This person that I am is not a good person. This person that I am cannot do things right. So therefore, I have a negative self-concept because I understand that I can't do things right. And I never will be able to do things right. And the brain is going to believe it. Your brain is like a computer. What you put into it, you believe. That becomes your reality. I'm always sick, I always will be sick. So even if you're not, your body's going to give you symptoms because it thinks you're sick. You know, whatever you put into the brain is what you're going to believe. Perception is everything, as I've said before. So whatever you put in the brain, that's what you're going to believe. And when you believe it so strongly that you don't challenge yourself. It takes somebody else usually to challenge yourself. Now, some people are strong enough to challenge themselves and say, is this right? I don't know if this is right or not, but it's very hard to do it on your own. You're better doing it with somebody else that can guide you through the process of therapy because, you get stuck. You can really get stuck. And you think of all the times that you did make a mistake, and that's your proof. Well, they were right. I didn't do those things right. You neglect the times when you did things brilliantly and nobody paid any attention to you. So those things, as far as you're concerned, didn't even count. So human beings are really complicated, and that you need to remember that. And also, I mentioned brain injury if you've been molested, and I don't mean necessarily that your head has been hit, but you can develop a brain injury from that. And your emotional development stops at that. And when your emotional development stops, unless you get the help you need, and one of the purposes of this program is I can point you in the right direction. I'm not your therapist, I'm not your doctor, I can't change the way that you're living, but what I can do is show you and talk to you about the fact that there is another way and you can seek it out. And so when you understand that, hey, maybe there's something better out there for me. Maybe I am good. Maybe I'm better than I thought I was. And then search that out. You can change your self-concept. But that's what happens with the brain injury. The brain now feels that what people have been telling you is right because you believe what's in the brain. The brain is like a computer. It accepts as truth whatever you put in it. So if it's been bombarded by negative stuff, and I'm not saying anyone's perfect, it has to be realistic, then what happens is that you believe it, it's your reality, you can't change that reality, you look at everything through that reality, so you can see how the brain development and what's being told you in terms of self-concept, in terms of personality, how it all blends together and all becomes a part of you. But it doesn't mean you can't make changes, because you can make changes. So you need to remember that your emotional development may be stunted because you weren't told anything right, and you were told a bunch of things that aren't true when you believed it, and you've stopped at that level and you haven't progressed further. In marriages, I just want to point this out and then I'll close because we are running out of time, but in marriages, a good marriage is one in which each person helps the other one to grow and encourages them to grow. And if they want to do things, they help them do it or they back them up as they do it. And so therefore you have an interchange of ideas and growth going on in both parties, and they're very happy. But as soon as something happens and the marriage starts to fail, then each partner starts to say negative things about the other. And then what happens is all that energy that was going into creativity and growth and development, which was so wonderful, all that energy is now spent in trying to preserve the relationship. But you only have so much energy. And if the energy needs to be used to preserve a relationship from harm, then it's not going to be used to be creative. So the creativeness of the human being, and we all have a certain amount of creativeness, that will stop. And what happens is that energy is used to try to preserve what you've got or to make what you've got better. And the creativity just kind of trails off in the distance, and then you don't have it anymore until a relationship is healed. The good news is that this healing for almost everybody can be healed of something. And if you're not healed of all of it, you can be healed to the extent that you can create something that's new. You can create a new reality for yourself. And people who have been abducted and have been tortured with the abduction, when they get over that and they get found and they get treated, things aren't the same as they were, but you can create a new reality for yourself. And that reality can be very, very, very satisfying and very, very creative in itself. Well, I've pretty much run out of time, so I'm going to close it here, but we'll continue with these kinds of things next time. So please join me then.